At my brother's wedding, my father raised his glass, smiled at the room full of people, and called me a failure. He didn't whisper it. He didn't make it sound like a joke. He said it into a microphone while nearly 200 people were watching me. To my oldest son, Dad said, turning toward my brother, the one who actually made something of himself. People laughed politely. Then Dad looked directly at me. And to my younger son, who still hasn't figured out what he wants to do with his life. There was an uncomfortable pause. My brother looked down at his plate, but I could tell he was smiling. Dad lifted his glass again. Maybe one day he'll understand that success requires ambition. I remember sitting there with my hands folded in front of me, thinking about how strange it was that the thing that hurt most wasn't what Dad said. It was how familiar it sounded. For most of my life, my family had measured success by things people could see. Job titles, cars, houses, expensive vacations. Who had the biggest paycheck? My brother, Ryan, had always fit that definition perfectly. I hadn't. Ryan was 3 years younger than me, but growing up, it felt like he was the older one, and I was the kid everyone expected to catch up. He was confident, outgoing, and naturally good at getting attention. I was quieter. I liked fixing things. I enjoyed working with numbers. I was the kid who would spend Saturday morning helping Grandpa repair something in his garage instead of going out with friends. Dad used to tell me I needed to think bigger. Ryan never heard that. When Ryan got a sales job after college, Dad called every relative he could think of. When I started working for a small financial consulting company, Dad barely mentioned it. When Ryan bought his first luxury car, my parents took pictures beside it. When I bought my first modest house, Mom asked why I hadn't waited until I could afford something more impressive. I learned pretty early not to explain myself. It wasn't worth it. My career wasn't flashy, but I was good at what I did. I helped small businesses organize their finances, improve their cash flow, and make better long-term decisions. Over time, I built a reputation. I also learned to live below my means. I didn't have a sports car. I didn't post pictures from expensive restaurants. I didn't talk about money at family gatherings. That became another reason my parents thought I wasn't ambitious. Ryan, meanwhile, had become a regional sales manager. He had a nice apartment, expensive clothes, and a talent for making ordinary achievements sound enormous. Dad loved it. Whenever relatives asked about us, Dad would say, "Ryan is doing very well. He's going places." Then he'd add something like, "We're still waiting to see what our other son does." I stopped correcting him. The one person who never treated me that way was Grandpa, Dad's father. Grandpa had been a quiet man. He rarely complimented anyone directly. Instead, he'd watch. He noticed who showed up, who kept promises, who worked when nobody was looking. When I was 26, he told me something I'll never forget. People confuse being noticed with being valuable. I laughed when he said it. I thought he was just trying to make me feel better. Years later, I understood exactly what he meant. Grandpa died when I was 34. At the funeral, Dad gave a long speech about how much Grandpa had taught him. I remember thinking that Grandpa would probably have laughed at half of it. Not because Dad was lying about loving him, but because Grandpa had never cared about speeches. He cared about what people did when nobody was watching. After the funeral, there was a small gathering at my parents' house. Ryan was already talking about a new promotion. Dad was telling relatives how successful his son was becoming. I stayed mostly quiet. Mom eventually came over and sat beside me. "You should be more like Ryan," she said. I looked at her. "In what way?" "He knows how to move forward." "I am moving forward." She shook her head. "Not in a way anyone can see." That sentence stayed with me. Not because I agreed with it. Because I realized then that my parents might never recognize the kind of life I was building. So I stopped trying to make them recognize it. A few years later, Ryan got engaged to Emily. Emily was nice. That was the frustrating part. She wasn't arrogant like Ryan sometimes was. She actually seemed uncomfortable whenever Dad praised Ryan too much. At one dinner, Dad spent nearly 20 minutes explaining Ryan's career to Emily's parents. When he finished, one of them asked what I did. Before I could answer, Dad said, "He does some kind of consulting." I smiled. "Financial consulting." Dad waved his hand. "Same difference." Emily looked at him. "No, I think that's actually pretty different." Dad changed the subject. I didn't say anything. The wedding planning became the main topic of every family conversation. Ryan wanted an impressive venue, a large guest list, a live band, a professional photographer. Nothing wrong with that. The problem was that my parents kept acting as if I was supposed to help pay for it. One evening, Mom called me. "Your brother's wedding is going to be beautiful." I hope so. We're still a little short on the final payment. I knew where this was going. How short? She named a number. It was significant. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Mom, I can't contribute that much." Her voice changed. "You can't." "No." "You own a house." "Yes." "You have savings." "Yes." "And you're telling me you can't help your brother?" I said I can't contribute that amount. She sighed. "Ryan would do it for you." I didn't argue. I simply said, "I'm sorry." For the next 2 weeks, things were cold. Then came the wedding. It was beautiful. Honestly, it was. The venue overlooked a lake. There were white flowers everywhere. The food was excellent. I was happy for Ryan and Emily. Whatever issues I had with my parents had nothing to do with their marriage. During the reception, I noticed Dad had been drinking more than usual. When it was time for the speeches, several people said kind things about the couple. Then Dad stood up. He talked about Ryan's childhood, about his determination, about his career, about how proud he was. I clapped. Then Dad looked toward me. "And Ryan's brother is here too." I felt my stomach tighten. People turned. Dad smiled. "He's always been the quiet one." A few people laughed. Dad continued. "He never had the drive Ryan had." I stared at my glass. Ryan understands that life rewards people who take risks. Then came the sentence. "My other son is still trying to figure out what he's doing." The room became very quiet. Dad raised his glass. "To Ryan, the successful one." Everyone clapped. I clapped too. I wasn't going to ruin my brother's wedding. After the toast, I stepped outside. I stood near the lake for a few minutes. Emily found me. "I'm sorry." I smiled. "You don't have to apologize." "That wasn't okay." "No." She looked embarrassed. "Ryan didn't know Dad was going to say that." "I believe you." She nodded. Then she said something unexpected. "You should know something." "What?" "Ryan talks about you more than you realize." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "He respects what you've built." That surprised me. I didn't know what to say. Before I could ask anything else, she went back inside. I stayed outside for another 10 minutes. Then I returned to the reception. I thought the worst part of the night was over. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, Dad called me. His voice sounded different. "Can you come over Sunday?" "Why?" "We need to talk." When I arrived, Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table. Ryan was there too. He looked nervous. Dad had several folders in front of him. I sat down. "What happened?" Dad pushed one folder toward me. "Your grandfather left instructions." I looked at him. "What kind of instructions?" Dad sighed. "After he died, we were told there was another part of his estate that wouldn't be distributed immediately." I didn't understand. Dad continued. "It involved a business investment he made years ago." I stared at the folder. Grandpa had owned a small machine parts company before retiring. I knew that. I didn't know much about the business. Dad said, "Your grandfather had put money into a manufacturing company with a few partners. Over the years, that investment became much more valuable." Ryan leaned back. "How valuable?" Dad looked at him. "Very." He opened the folder. There were legal documents, account statements, and copies of an agreement I'd never seen. Then he said something that made the room completely silent. "Grandpa left the majority ownership interest to you." I thought I had misheard him. "Me?" Dad nodded. Ryan stared at the documents. "Why?" Dad looked uncomfortable. "Because the agreement was signed years ago." I picked up one of the papers. My name was there. Not Dad's. Not Ryan's. Mine. The ownership had been placed into a trust with specific conditions. I couldn't simply sell everything. I couldn't drain the assets. The arrangement provided me with controlling ownership while requiring the business to continue operating for several years. There was also a letter. Dad slid it across the table. "Read it." I unfolded it. It was from Grandpa. The letter was short. He explained that he had watched all of us over the years. He said he wasn't leaving the investment to the person who looked most successful. He was leaving it to the person he believed would protect it. Then he wrote something that made my eyes burn. "I know you may never understand why I chose you until you're much older." He had written that when I was 31. He had known. He knew exactly what my family thought of me. He knew I was being underestimated. And apparently, he'd chosen me anyway. I looked up. Dad was staring at the table. Ryan finally spoke. Did you know? No. Dad nodded. We didn't. I believed him. That mattered. For all my frustration with my parents, I wasn't interested in inventing another reason to hate them. Ryan asked, so what happens now? I explained what the attorneys had already told me. I would become the controlling owner. But the business wasn't some pile of cash waiting to be divided. It was a real company with employees, contracts, equipment, and responsibilities. It would take work. I couldn't just sell it and walk away. Ryan looked at me. So you're basically a business owner now. I smiled slightly. Apparently. He laughed once. Not sarcastically. More like he couldn't believe it. Dad finally looked at me. I owe you an apology. I wasn't expecting that. He continued. I've spent years thinking success had to look a certain way. Mom started crying quietly. Dad rubbed his hands together. I was wrong. I didn't immediately forgive him. But I also didn't punish him. I just said, I appreciate you saying that. A few weeks later, I met with the company's management team. That was when I realized Grandpa's decision made sense. The company wasn't glamorous. It was steady. Its employees had worked there for decades. People knew each other. They cared about keeping the business alive. The former owner had been preparing to retire, and Grandpa had apparently spent years protecting the company from being sold to a larger corporation. I understood what he had been trying to preserve. It wasn't just money. It was stability. So I kept the existing management team. I invested in new equipment. I improved the employee benefits. I didn't change everything just to prove I was in charge. Over time, the company grew. Not dramatically. Not overnight. Just steadily. 6 months later, Ryan came to visit. We sat in my office. He looked around. This is weird. What is? I remember Dad telling everyone you didn't know what you were doing. I laughed. He wasn't the only one. Ryan looked down. I believed him. I didn't respond. He continued. I think I liked being the successful son. I know. I don't anymore. That surprised me. He told me that after the wedding, Emily had confronted him. She told him she thought the way Dad treated me was wrong. Ryan said he started thinking about it. He realized how much of his identity came from being compared to me. I was always trying to win a competition you weren't even participating in. That was probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. I smiled. I wasn't. I know. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he asked, Are we okay? I thought about it. We're getting there. He nodded. That was enough. The next Christmas, our family gathered at my parents' house. Dinner was quieter than usual. Dad eventually stood up. For a second, I thought he was going to give another speech. Instead, he looked at me. I want to say something. I almost laughed. Dad smiled. I know I haven't always made you feel proud to be my son. Nobody moved. I compared you to your brother when I shouldn't have. Ryan looked at me. Dad continued. And I confused attention with achievement. Mom reached over and held his hand. Dad looked directly at me. You didn't become successful because Grandpa left you something. He paused. You were already successful. He just saw it before I did. I didn't know how to respond. So I simply said, Thank you. That was it. No dramatic reconciliation. No perfect family transformation. Things didn't suddenly become easy. My parents still had opinions. Ryan and I still disagreed sometimes. But something had changed. I stopped needing them to understand me. And somehow, once I stopped needing their approval didn't have the same power over me anymore. A year after the wedding, I visited Grandpa's old garage. My father had kept most of his tools. I found the old workbench where Grandpa and I used to repair things together. There was a small photograph sitting on the shelf. It was me and Grandpa. I was probably 22. We were both covered in grease, and I was smiling at the camera. I remembered something he'd told me that day. Don't worry about being the loudest person in the room. At the time, I thought he was talking about confidence. Now I realized he was talking about character. My father had spent years announcing who he thought was successful. Grandpa had simply watched. And when the time came, he trusted the person who had never needed an audience. I used to think my family had made me feel like a failure. Now I realized they only made the mistake of measuring me with the wrong ruler. I didn't need to prove my worth at my brother's wedding. I didn't need to embarrass anyone afterward. I didn't need revenge. The truth had done something better. It had given everyone a chance to see what had been there all along. And for the first time in my life, when someone asked me whether I felt successful, I didn't think about my job, my house, my bank account, or what my family thought. I thought about Grandpa's old workbench. I thought about the people who trusted me. I thought about the life I'd built quietly while everyone was busy looking somewhere else. Then I realized I had never actually been waiting for my family to approve of me. I had just been waiting to approve of myself. And I finally did.